I'm Brock Finkbeiner, and we are Franklin College students. We did a paper, an ethnographic paper over correctional officers.
I'm Rebekah.
I'm Sydney.
I'm Leyton.
Our first question is, what is your subculture, most of which mainstream culture would recognize about them, and why?
I think the biggest thing we can all agree is that they want to be seen as more professional people than how they're portrayed. About how they're not guards looking over a monument. They have a lot of duties and responsibilities that they got to take care of.
I would say that correctional officers wish people knew that they had a strict code of ethics and values such as integrity and honesty, and that they're not easily corruptible as the media sometimes presents them.
During one of our interviews, or when we were trying to get interviews, I ended up calling one of the places that hosts correctional officers. It was a women's prison up in Indianapolis, and I used the word prison guards, and I was very much so berated for that word because they tend to think that prison guards is derogatory. And this is because the term guard tends to sound like they're babysitting something or they're guarding something rather than interacting with people and forming relationships with people that are inmates. And that was something that's interesting.
The next question is, what stereotypes do they appreciate, and what stereotypes do they dislike?
Throughout our interviews and observations, we couldn't really identify any stereotypes that they liked. No, it was mostly just negative things in the media that we tend to hear about how they're brutish people or that they're unintelligent, when in reality it's really not that way.
Yeah, I think going off what you're saying, there are stereotypes that they're unprofessional, there are stereotypes that they're callous or they're enforcers of these rules for no good reason, or that they don't have the intellect to differentiate between when something is an excessive amount of force or when it isn't. And so they disliked a lot of those stereotypes, and they felt like through the project that they could disband some of those with us.
I don't think that there was a single stereotype that they identified with as far as their profession.
I think something that's important too is like each of the people that we interviewed were diverse in the way that they approached the questions and the feelings that they felt about the prison system in general, or they felt about their job. And so saying that like there was stereotypes that they did identify with was hard to find. Didn't see any that were like particularly like prevalent in all four of ours.
Third question is, what piece of evidence did you all find as a group that were most surprising or intriguing?
Well, like Sydney said, they very much don't appreciate being called guards because their job's a lot more involved than that, and they also, in some cases, were invested with the people they oversaw, and then in other cases they were very disconnected and more focused on self-preservation and preservation of the people they were overseeing.
In my interview, I interviewed a former correctional officer who took an inmate into the hospital for a psychiatric evaluation and witnessed one of their regular prisoners die of a black tar heroin overdose. And I found that story to be really not only intriguing, but also very disturbing, just because you don't think about that kind of stuff happening in your own community, but it does. And I just really was so touched and destroyed by that story at the same time.
Yeah, I think going off of that, it tended to depend, or I found a pattern with your correctional officer that was outside of the system that we were interviewing, and the person that I interviewed who was more of an administrator or trainer for other correctional officers. It seemed the difference in tone was very prevalent. Yours tended to kind of say things the way that they are in a very like low context manner, and was very forward about the problems that he saw in the system and the ways in which the experience of a correctional officer is horrific. Whereas the thing that I found most intriguing was the person that I interviewed that was administrative tended to seem like he was withholding information from me. I think it's possibly in part that they would not let me have a phone interview. I could only have an interview through email. It seemed as if there was a lot of things that he would answer in a very short manner without personal experience behind it, and that kind of just shows that that guys or that stereotype or that wanting to portray the idea that they are professionals. The one time that he did open up or talk about anything that was seemingly personal was when I asked him about how his family felt about his profession, and he tended to come right out and say that they didn't enjoy him being in what he deemed as such a dangerous situation, or a situation that pulled him away from his family. So.
The next question, how did your subculture react to being studied by a group of college students? What does this tell you about the subculture?
They were surprised mostly. Usually when someone references a correctional officer or contacts a correctional officer, it's for negative reasons. And so to have someone offer to do an interview and get their side of the story of the thing, they were very taken aback by it.
Yeah, I think we all can kind of agree that it was really hard to get in touch with the people we were interviewing. We tried for about 2 weeks to try to get anybody to give us a call back. We kept getting, a lot of automatic voice messaging systems that were unhelpful. And Rebekah and I were talking about this beforehand. It just seems like because a lot of the times people are calling to complain about the behavior of a CO, that those bureaucratic barriers to even being able to have a conversation with a CO tends to be barriers to people expressing emotions towards the COs. They kind of act as an emotional buffer, where it might be 2 or 3 weeks before you can talk to a CO to voice your concern, and that tends to give you weeks to cool off. We think that might be part of the reason why it was there so isolated and so hard to get in touch with.
When we did finally get in touch with them and speak to them, we had different experiences with how easy or hard they were to open up and talk. In my experience, it was very easy for him to talk about his experiences. He shared lots of stories and details that weren't even necessarily so pleasant to talk about, I'm sure, for him. He was very easy to talk to, and he wanted, I think, to tell me about his story and about his experience, whereas that's not the experience that Sydney had at all.
And also going off of Leyton, he said that they were surprised. Whenever I went in and told them that we were observing them or interviewing them for a subculture, they didn't even realize that they were a subculture. So I thought that was very intriguing that they didn't even realize that they were different than mainstream culture.
Yeah, I think that kind of highlights how diverse they were. Seemingly that even then themselves didn't really identify as a group. They were so, Rebekah's, CO's attitudes towards the prison system was completely different than mine, which was completely different than Leyton's. It just seems like there's so much diversity within the subculture. That was shown very prevalently.
Well, that leads into our next question too about what we found most difficult or challenging about studying the subculture, and that because they were so diverse, we had trouble drawing conclusions. Whereas Rebekah's source was very negative as they were looking back on their experience. Mine and Sydney's seemed to be mostly positive, and Brock's was different from that. So having to look at all the evidence and make a conclusion about that wasn't easy.
And in the same way, it was sort of hard to remove our own personal biases from our research because they are stories that are prevalent in the media that are very sensationalized, and it's hard to take a step back from that and try to research with a unbiased eye.
Next question is, what happened during the process of your research that was rewarding, funny, heartwarming, interesting, or surprising?
Well, a lot of what happens on the job of a correctional officer hardly seems to be funny. We, of course, had stories about the inmate who died of the black tar heroin overdose, and my source spoke a lot about what he did to help prisoners raise their own moral standards, but there was hardly anything in there, if any at all, about funny, knee-slapping stories about experiences they had on other careers.
I think the one thing that is, I don't know if I would consider it funny, maybe heartwarming, was the idea of how close correctional officers are to other correctional officers, just because they have that shared experience. I know the person I interviewed talked a lot about how the experience of working with inmates is traumatic in some ways, because you have these people that are you have to empathize with, or you are empathizing with, and they've kind of been failed by the system in certain ways, or there's not enough rehabilitation programs, or they just keep coming back and you see the same faces, and that's really hard for correctional officers. And the way in which they kind of deal with all of that pent-up emotion, maybe not even directed towards a person, but just kind of directed in general, is through their relationships with other COs. It's very much similar to a military brotherhood of sorts. My particular person I interviewed talked a lot about after the shift, him and the other correctional officers he was working with would go out and drink some soda and eat some candy out in the parking lot and just do what he called de-stressing, but just kind of talk about the day and talk about what happened. So they really do help each other to kind of reclaim their humanity in a sense, after seeing so much, or having to be so much of an enforcer to these very callous rules of sorts. So I found that really interesting.
Next question. How did the experience of researching an unfamiliar subculture change your perspective at all? What did you learn that could apply to other areas of your life?
Well, as we were talking about before, it was difficult to enter the situation unbiased, especially because the only things portrayed through the media are very negative. And so one thing I think we can all take away from it is to maybe try to withhold judgment when learning about a new group of people in the future, so that we don't draw the wrong conclusions because we come in there thinking we know more than we do.
Especially public servants or police officers or COs,
Right.
especially in that line of work.
I think we were all surprised again about how diverse a subculture can be. We tend to think of subcultures as kind of having one idea of some artifacts, they use the same verbiage, but really there's a lot of diversity even within the subculture. And I think that's important to consider when you're talking about stereotypes, that it's regional, and I think it's important to point out that we interviewed from a lot of different prisons. You and I did Johnson County, I think, where did you?
Johnson County in Florida.
In Florida, so we have some differences, regional differences as well, so it's a difference.
Finally, what ways, if any, do you see Franklin or Indiana differently as a result of this research?
my interview specifically talked about the drug problem in Franklin. And I knew there was a drug problem in Franklin because there's a drug problem everywhere now. But I didn't think it was so prevalent. And his interview was very unsettling and disturbing, at least to me, to know that it was so close to home.
Yeah, I think like going off of what you're saying there, when my correctional officer talked about rehabilitation programs, that like a lot of correctional officers tend to think that like they need to be pulling more resources towards rehabilitation programs, and there's not enough. But either way, drugs and the people that use them kind of continue, without those programs, continue to kind of go back, and they see the same ones again, and they see the same ones again, and that tends to be for things that are